Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating, sometimes pretty intense set of perspectives. These come from a YouTube transcript we've been looking at. This deep dive, it's all about navigating, media criticism, political talk. Yeah. Specifically around a very high-profile figure and some, frankly, surprising accusations. So our mission really is to unpack these claims. Everything from, believe it or not, alleged food poisoning as a political trick, right through to the nature of truth itself in public debate. Get ready. It's quite a ride. Bold claims, counterclaims, how public opinion gets shaped.
Yeah, and what's really interesting here, I think, is how the source material doesn't just give you one side of the story. It also spends time reflecting on the, let's say, tactics and the perceived effectiveness of different ways people communicate, especially when things get politically heated. So we'll be focusing on really understanding the different viewpoints in these sources, not obviously endorsing any particular one, just laying them out.
Okay, right. Let's unpack this first one then. It's quite something. The source says the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, reportedly ate spoiled food, and this apparently led to 3 days of rest. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The source suggests this timing was a bit suspicious, a coincidence, happening just before a really crucial cross-examination in a legal case. The implication, reading between the lines in the source, is maybe the Prime Minister actually intentionally ate spoiled food just to delay that meeting.
That is quite a claim, isn't it? Straight out of the gate. And it immediately, it brings up this important point about how we interpret the auctions of political figures, especially when you have health things mixing with legal proceedings. The source is pretty explicit, framing it as deliberate. It even mentions the Prime Minister's doctor who signed off on his return. It just shows this deep level of suspicion, doesn't it? Where even being sick is viewed politically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't stop there. The source goes on to claim this alleged act. Eating bad food to dodge a legal meeting. It also ended up raising expectations among 50 families of missing persons, end quote. And get this, it was described as sabotaging the morals of the state for a deal. So the idea presented is that he was undermining the whole country, really, just for personal avoidance, especially related to efforts to get missing persons back in those ongoing talks for prisoner or hostage exchanges.
Right. And if we connect that to the bigger picture, the source actually presents this whole spoiled food story as an example of what it calls a delusional and kind of low-level accusation against the Prime Minister. So it highlights the intense scrutiny, the nature of these public attacks that are discussed in the source. It's suggesting some critiques are just seen as baseless, designed purely to attack.
Okay, so building on that idea, the manipulation, the narratives, the source then pivots. It turns its attention to the people reporting on this stuff. Specifically, it singles out a prominent journalist, Raviv Drucker, for some pretty heavy criticism. It says Drucker is accused of spreading lies on a major Israeli channel, no less, Prime.
And according to the source, these aren't just any lies. They're supposedly harming the state of Israel itself and the families of hostages. Because, the source claims, these alleged lies are distancing the deal, those critical negotiations for a prisoner or hostage exchanges we just mentioned. It's a really direct accusation, serious stuff, national damage, basically.
Wow. And one specific thing Drucker apparently said, mentioned in the source, is that the Prime Minister advanced the visit to Trump and, by doing that, sabotaged negotiations. That's a very pointed claim about political strategy.
It is. But the source immediately pushes back with a direct counterargument. It claims, quote, "The whole world knows, besides Raviv Drucker, that Hamas refuses every deal that Israel has made flexible again." So that directly contradicts what Drucker reportedly claimed, according to the source. It presents a completely different picture of who's actually holding up the negotiation.
Right. And this leads into a really powerful concept the source brings up. It says, there is a disease called just not Bibi, and there are people who cannot recover from it.
Yeah.
The source basically implies Drucker has this disease, suggesting it's bias, not objective reporting. That's a really strong way to put it, calling it a disease.
It's incredibly effective rhetorically from the source's viewpoint because it tries to delegitimize the criticism itself, right? It suggests it's coming from some inherent, almost irrational opposition, not from factual disagreement. And this phrase, just not Bibi, it's not unique to this situation, is it? You see this pattern in lots of polarized political environments where opposition becomes about the person, the identity, more than the policy. And that makes compromise or even just objective assessment really, really difficult. The source is basically saying, from its perspective, some criticism just comes from an inability to accept the PM no matter the facts.
Okay. So beyond attacking specific people like Drucker, the source also offers this broader critique of, certain styles of journalism. It doesn't like what it calls extreme, daring, and personal expressions by journalists. And to make its point, the source quotes another journalist, Guy Peleg. Apparently, he made a comment about a trial recess. The source calls it crude, something about, bodily functions. And the source reacts really strongly, calling it unbelievable and sarcastically comparing it to like lines from a great poet, basically saying public discourse has gone downhill.
Yeah, that example really hits on this question about boundaries, doesn't it? Journalistic commentary versus, just slinging mud.
Yeah.
And the perceived decline in the level of public conversation in these really charged situations, the source seems to be really lamenting that.
So, okay, we've got these strong criticisms of journalists' view that things are getting extreme. What's the impact then? And this is where it gets really interesting, because the source pulls out a surprising twist, a counterintuitive argument. It argues that these very extreme expressions by journalists, they actually do a good service to the prime minister and to what it calls the sober public in Israel, which it says is the overwhelming majority.
Yeah, that is a fascinating turn, isn't it? Really counterintuitive. The reasoning, according to the source, is that the more extreme and personal the attacks get, the better the public can actually make the distinction. They can supposedly discern what is relevant and what is irrelevant, and maybe what comes from the gut and what comes from reason. So it suggests that this kind of over-the-top criticism might actually backfire. It could lead the public to become more discerning, maybe even more supportive of the person being attacked. It's an argument that extreme attacks actually clarify things.
Interesting take. So circling back then to that initial claim, the spoiled food, the illness, the source says the idea of the prime minister being afraid of Mr. Admore, the cross-examiner in that legal case, it finds that idea a bit funny.
Right, and it clarifies why. It states that, based on its observation anyway, in recent cross-examinations, Admore did not come out so well. So it subtly undermines the whole idea that the PM would need to fake an illness to avoid Admore, because, the source suggests, Admore wasn't really landing any blows anyway. It kind of deflates the whole spoiled food conspiracy theory within its own narrative, you see.
Right. And then just to give a final sort of perspective, the source adds this brief, almost philosophical or spiritual comment. It says something like, before the Messiah is revealed, many will be clarified and cleansed, implying that, the truth will eventually come out through some kind of purification process.
Yeah, and that's not just a throwaway line, I think. It gives this final, almost ideological layer to the source's whole perspective. It suggests that even with all the current confusion, the accusations flying back and forth, there's this underlying belief that clarity and truth will emerge in the end. It acts as a pretty powerful closing thought on, the nature of truth in these big public debates, framing the current chaos as maybe necessary before you get to understand.
Wow. Well, this deep dive has certainly given us a real window into this complex world. Political accusations, how the media covers them, public perception, all from just this one source. We've seen these claims about deliberate sabotage with spoiled food, accusations of biased reporting flying around, and even that really surprising idea that maybe extreme criticism helps the public see clearer.
I think the key takeaway is really seeing how these different stories, these narratives, get built up and then pushed back again, and how trust in institutions, including the media, is just constantly being negotiated and challenged. We've really just explored the claims presented in this source today, right? Not taking a side, just trying to understand the information and the different viewpoints it holds.
Absolutely. And ultimately, this whole discussion, this deep dive, it just reminds you, doesn't it, how vital it is to always consider the source, the context, the possible motivations behind the information you come across. So what stands out to what you, listening to all this, about how these narratives get formed and how people perceive them? It kind of leaves us with this final thought. In a world with such intense political and media battles, how do you personally figure out what truly matters? What's coming from the gut, as the source put it, versus what's coming from reason? Lots to think about.